Pope Francis is summoning more than 100 bishops from around the world for an unprecedented summit on clergy sex abuse. The Vatican hopes Thursday's meeting will be a turning point in efforts to protect minors.
The Pope has faced growing criticism for his handling of the crisis.
So joining us now in Rome is Seth Doane, who's been following the events leading up to the summit. Seth, there's a lot of breaking news coming out even before this summit has even started. What's the latest, and how is the Vatican responding?
That's right, Anne-Marie. There has been a lot of news. This summit has generated a lot of news. It was announced back in September, and slowly it has gained more and more momentum, more focus, and more attention. And on Saturday, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which is the Vatican's investigative body that looks into issues of clerical sex abuse, made the bombshell announcement, the much anticipated but still bombshell announcement, that former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, the American who rose to the top of the ranks of the church in the U.S., he was the Archbishop of Washington, D.C., he had been defrocked. Officially, that's called dismissed from the clerical state. Now, he is the most senior figure in modern times to be defrocked. He had already been punished back in July when he had lost his red hat, when he was stripped of the title of cardinal. He was, at that point, the first cardinal in nearly a century to lose the title of cardinal. He was still, after that, called the Most Reverend, but now that he's been dismissed from the clerical state, the highest punishment that the Catholic Church can impose, he is simply Mr. McCarrick. So that was a big announcement that was made on Saturday. There was some reporting in the New York Times and also some great reporting by my colleague Roxana Saberi and producer Justine Redmond, who have been doing some reporting on the children of priests. The New York Times used that story last night. We did it this morning on CBS This Morning with Roxana's piece, and we had a confirmation from the Vatican spokesperson, Alessandro Gisotti, who told us that indeed there is a document that exists that are sort of guidelines for priests who father children. The Gisotti went on to say that it is an internal document, not meant for a publication, and at the core of that document is the protection of minors, which of course is what this summit and this week is all about.
Yeah, and as you point out, Seth, Roxana and Justine had been working on that piece and had filed it several weeks ago before the New York Times released their piece last night. So what is the plan for this summit, and what is the Vatican hoping to accomplish?
The plan is to get together more than 100 bishops from around the world. These are heads of bishops' conferences, so in essence the boss of each bishop conference is being brought here, called here by the Pope to the Vatican to discuss the protection of minors. Now, even the distinction of protection of minors is indeed a distinction among Vaticanistas, because for a long time there was talk here about also looking at vulnerable adults, and now the Vatican is steering away from this definition of vulnerable or this category of vulnerable adults and saying focusing on minors and what is achieved and focusing on the clerical sex abuse scandals and the sexual abuse of minors will then have ripple effects through the church. But the idea is to get together these more than 100 bishops around the world to discuss guidelines and try to find a way to standardize procedures. Now, there are real questions of what exactly can be accomplished, because places like the U.S. Catholic Church has already put in place guidelines back in 2002 to deal with clerical sex abuse and the protection of minors. So in a way, this is kind of trying to catch up the rest of the world to guidelines that are already in place in other parts of the world. One thing to be looking for is, will there be any sort of bishop accountability? Right now, there are rules, guidelines for predator priests who either carry out abuse or protect other predator priests. The question will be, will bishops also be held accountable? Right now, the Pope has to declare that a bishop can be investigated by the Vatican. They are not automatically investigated. So there is that loophole that some are looking to close.
I think it is significant, though, that the Vatican has invited sexual abuse survivors to speak. What does this mean for the Church?
It is significant. The question is, how big of a role will these sexual abuse survivors really be playing? We spoke with one of the abuse survivors who's been brought here to the Vatican. His name is Phil Saviano. You might remember him from Spotlight fame. He was abused back in the 1960s. He told his story to the Boston Globe. He's been becoming public with his story since 1992, and here he is again. He says it feels a bit like deja vu. Now, he did point out that he is one of the estimated 10 survivors who will be meeting with organizers of this summit tomorrow on the eve of the summit, not during the summit itself. And he was making a little point of that, saying, you know, it would have been nice to kind of speak to a wider audience, but he will be speaking to the organizers of the summit. There will also be abuse survivors who will be part of the daily prayer each day. And the Vatican also said, we invited all of the bishops coming to this conference, this summit, to please encourage them to please speak with victims of abuse before coming to the summit. There will also be some taped pieces of survivors on videotape that we played during the summit itself. So survivors will be a part of it. The question is, how much of a role will they be playing?
You know, Seth, this is certainly historic, but I sort of paused when I think I heard a report the other day where the Pope was suggesting that we all sort of limit our expectations. And I wondered, well, you know, what is the point of that then? What is going to come out of this?
I asked Archbishop Charles Scicluna about that yesterday. He is one of the organizers here. We were meeting with him, the press was meeting with him, and I said, you know, what was your sense, as you mentioned, Anne-Marie, when Pope Francis said we should deflate expectations? I was actually on the plane with him coming back from Panama during that press conference when he made that point. It was a bit shocking because he announced this meeting, the Holy Father announced this meeting back in September, so there has been great anticipation looking up to this. And what Charles Scicluna, the Archbishop, said was, well, that is a very Jesuit way. The Pope, of course, is a Jesuit. That is a Jesuit way of kind of lowering expectations, being very modest. And he said, look, we cannot expect to solve this problem in 3.5, which was a 4-day summit, but there are really 3 full working days. We can't expect to solve all of the issues plaguing the Church on this crisis in 3 working days, but follow-up will be key. But I agree. I think disappointing to many who heard the Holy Father, Pope Francis himself, say, please, let's not overinflate expectations here.
Yeah. Seth, you are there at the Vatican. We will be talking to you over the next couple of days frequently here on CBSN. Thank you so much for your reporting.
Thanks for having me.